Hey and welcome. My name is Daniel Ibanez. I'm an oil painter who became a digital artist, and so I love digital oil painting in ArtRage Vitae. My tutorial today is going to be starting out with some just basic fundamental first principles, really friendly for beginners, and we're going to gradually work our way up to more and more sophisticated tutorials. Check out this tutorial to learn about ArtRage, learn about oil painting, learn about my technique, learn about my brush settings, how I make brushes, and how I set up my canvas. We're going to set up our canvas right now. Going into canvas settings, I'm going to set the paper to a rough paper texture with the grain set to 100. These are some of the brush settings I've got there. You can see the aspect, the stiffness and stuff. We'll go over that more as we get into it. But first I want to click over on the actively selected color and make sure that real color blending is turned on. ArtRage has had real color blending enabled forever, since the beginning, I think. So that means that when you mix blue and yellow paint, it literally makes green, just true green like you would find if you were painting with oils or acrylics or whatever tube-based paint you were using. It's awesome and it works really well, and you'll see the benefits of that in this painting. But firstly, we're going to start with these settings. The oil brush is interesting. All the brushes are interesting. ArtRage works just a little differently than everything else on the market. It uses these little sliders to change the virtual shape of the brush, whereas in, say, Photoshop, you have a stamp and then you can control like the stamp and the texture of the brush. You can make brushes by changing the stamp and the texture and the ways that those sorts of things interact. But the way ArtRage works is they have these virtual bristles that you can change the kind of the pressure, the thinners, the loading, the depth, the gloss, aspect, rotation, and stiffness of that virtual bristle. And when you do that, you get wildly different like outcomes, right? So as someone who's done traditional painting, and that's my background, I found this to be really intuitive, really natural, and works just like I would expect it to work. You can have a square head, a round head brush. You can make a traditional round. You can make almost like a fan brush. You can make a filbert or a flat. And the brushes have a real nice believability in the way that they interact with that digital canvas. Here you can see all I'm doing is blocking local color with my custom brush, and I like doing this step as fast and geometric as possible. You can see that I am color sampling from the reference picture, and this is a copyright-free reference picture from pexels.com, and I'm color sampling from the reference picture. I know that's not always like a best practice, but I'm starting to use this as sort of like a beginner tutorial where if you're just trying to get used to new software, you're trying to get used to new program, new tools, or if you're just trying to go really fast, sometimes I'll let myself color sample in that regard, or doing tutorials or whatever like this. Color sampling is it's one of those things that some people love, some people hate, some people frown upon. And it is one of those sort of like cheat modes in digital art that you have to decide how and when and if you're going to use it. That said, in a beginner tutorial, I have absolutely no qualms about jumping in with the color picker, where you can just alt click and tap on any color in the reference image and jump in with grabbing that color and quickly applying that on your painting. This painting was fun for me because I love doing sci-fi fantasy work. I'm getting ready for San Diego Comic-Con. Hopefully it happens in a traditional sense this year. What I just did there is I pushed H on the keyboard to flip the canvas so I could see if my proportions were accurate, and my drawing was good, and I think it felt all right. So I'm going to move on. I like using this very angular flat brush. It's an oil brush setting that I custom created for this kind of work. And I think using a flat with a real angular mark, it's very geometric. It has a strong graphic look, and it just has a lot of pop. So working with this brush is great for starting out because everything is just very, it just has a lot of impact, right? We work from dark values through the midtones into the lights. And that's just to keep ourselves organized in terms of process. Starting with the darks of the painting is helping you get the bones established, help you get those all important sorts of there's the structure of the piece established. And once you get that in, you can feel that quality of the light, you can feel the light direction. Then you can start playing with little things and little refinements and tweaks and stuff. But before that's in, you're really nowhere. So you got to get those darks in right away and start establishing the bones of the piece. That said, you can see me now using even larger brushes. One of my big beliefs is that the bigger brush you use, the better. Now here's what I'm doing right now. I'm playing around with making new brush. I wanted one that had the same, if not a little bit better coverage. So what I did was drop the stiffness down. That gives me less of a bristly mark and gives me more even coverage. And then I bring the thinners up, which is going to give me slightly just a little less bulky of a mark. It's going to be a little less 3D. And now using that same mark, but pulling the loading way down and pushing the thinner up a little bit more, it's going to give me kind of a foggy, almost smoky mark where it's like a dry brush technique. And it's really going to pick up on the tooth of the paper, this kind of rough paper texture that I've got. I wanted it to look like sort of an oil painting on like a cold pressed paper. And so that's kind of the effect I have. And using this brush setting that you can see here with the thinners at about 48%, the low 40-50%, the loading down really, really, really tiny, means that you're not putting very much pigment on the brush, and then you're just kind of skimming across the canvas texture, and it's going to pick up a lot of that tooth. You'll see that this particular brush is going to knock down some of the bristly, bold bravado of the initial strokes. And that can be good or bad depending on what you want to have. Sometimes you want things to look really bold and bristly, and other times you want them to look smooth and kind of refined. So with ArtRage, the way you do that is playing with loading, playing with stiffness of the brush, and playing with the thinners. You can really make the paint do anything you want. You can have it be bristly and textured. You can have it be thin and kind of, like I said, sort of smoky with that kind of picking up the tooth of the canvas. And then you can change the canvas to be whatever kind of tooth you want. There's a lot of things going on here in ArtRage where you're mixing the kind of loading of the brush. More loading equals more paint, the stiffness of the bristles, and then the sort of that gives you more or less kind of like scratch and kind of ridge in your stroke. And then you also have the ability to control kind of the thinness. It's just a totally different way to set up a paint program. For digital artists, they might be like, wow, this is weird, right? But for a traditional artist, it's the only thing that makes sense. So ArtRage has been a great tool for me to use in my journey into digital art, and I've had a heck of a lot of fun, and through ArtRage, that was sort of my gateway drug to all digital art tools. And I paint with everything these days, but I always come back to ArtRage because there's really nothing else that works like it works. And I always use ArtRage for its oil painting. That's, I think, its strongest tool. And seeing as I'm coming at this with a background in oil painting, that makes sense that I love it, right? So here you can see me just going in and adding some of the warm tones reflecting off of the stone wall into that cool shadow of the helmet. Now I'm going in and trying to refine in some of the highlights and shadows, little just flecks of brush strokes to suggest highlights or the edge or rim lighting on something, and a little piece of the armor reflecting here, or a little piece of the cloak kind of absorbing like the shadow, getting the occluded shadows in there or whatever. This is that part of the painting where I'm working quickly, but I'm being a little bit more careful about the little things, catching little ridges of light, little edges of this, little flecks of that. This is where I let my brush be smaller. This is where I let my tool be more detail oriented. And I think this is a really fun part of the painting, and it's a way to get back, to sort of satisfy that longing for making things look really pretty. I'm a real big believer that in the beginning of the painting you should just be bold and crazy and just get as much paint on the canvas as possible right away. And I set up my brushes in the beginning to really be good at that and let everything be big and bold and messy. And now I've got my brush set up to be a lot more refined. My thinner's back to 0. My loading is only at about 7%, and then I have the stiffness pulled down so I get kind of a smoother mark. This is a great brush for doing nice, choppy, but still kind of smooth finishing work. It's just a good all-around brush. So throughout this painting process, I've been able to show you at least 4 different brush settings for how I might use different brushes with different settings for different parts of a painting. And that's going to be dependent on you, how you would want to employ this. But I just kind of want to talk about the tool itself. Again, we're talking about maybe beginners in ArtRage. There's tons of different people that can show you how to start a painting or how to finish a painting, but it's important to learn how to use a tool and make it work for you. So I want to show you one more quick tip here before we get to the end. I made a new layer and I set up a new brush that has almost no loading, no thinners, and has a lot of stiffness in the brush. So that's going to give the bristles are going to be just really kind of ridge-like. There's going to be a lot of like gaps and negative space in each brush stroke. So it's very much like a traditional dry brush technique. And when you do dry brush, what you're doing is you're scraping texture across an already dry canvas, and you're going to be able to see the paint coming from underneath, and you're going to see that mix with kind of what would be like optical mixing. So you're seeing the two colors together or the two textures together at the same time. And it's a very cool way to add a whole nother layer of life to your painting without having to do anything that's destructive to the initial layer. And here you can see I put the loading back up so I can get more kind of a longer stroke. In ArtRage, because the paint stays wet, sometimes layers are helpful if you want to go into sort of like, if you want to do something that's really detailed without it mixing at all with the layer underneath. You can always set in the brush the Insta Dry setting, which will put paint down that will not mix with what's already there. But for me, I'd rather keep everything as wet so that wet on wet mixing is always happening. It saves you tons of time to work that way. And it's really nice as it simulates how oil paints really work. But then instead of changing that Insta-Dry setting, I usually just create a new layer and do my dry brush stuff on a separate layer like that. Very, very fun. Very, very cool. Here you can see that the setting I'm using is a really advantageous brush for knocking in some of that last little detail. And you can see the paint mixing between the layers. You can see the textures mixing between the layers. You can see the way that optical mixing is happening because the brush stiffness is kind of scraping across that canvas, and it's just a very satisfying outcome. ArtRage is at its best in its oil painting, and if you can kind of approach it like a traditional oil painter, you'll have a heck of a lot of fun. Embracing the wet on wet on the canvas is going to interact with the three-dimensional paint body. It's going to give you natural paint mixing as you're working, and you're going to enjoy it if you can handle a little bit of chaos. So you can set it up so that it's got a lot more control. You can set the thinner so that the paint doesn't mix super a lot. But for me, I like to kind of let it be bold. I let it be a little bit crazy, let it be a little bit messy. And I kind of work everything as if it was kind of alla prima, or like I'm painting directly with my subject. I like to work everything as though it's like a quick concept sketch or a thumbnailing, because I think in that I get a lot more freshness. And I think ArtRage does a great job with that freshness with the oil paints. So hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. Quick look at my paint style, quick look at my techniques, and also a very beginner friendly setup for grabbing paint and painting from a reference. Thanks so much. Welcome back, painters. This is Daniel Ibanez painting in ArtRage Vitae, this time on the PC. Again, you can paint in this software on iPad, Android, PC, or Mac. And it is a really lightweight app that can do powerful things. So using today the oil brush right now, but this is really a painting that's done primarily with the palette knife. The palette knife is the great kind of understudy or sidekick to the oil brush, but I think that it also has ability to be the main event. And that's what we're going to explore in this video. And, let me get some of the establishing marks here, some of the establishing values, kind of find my way in this painting a little bit. And then I'll show you where we can plug in the palette knife. The palette knife has a bunch of different presets and a bunch of different ways you can use it. And it's an important tool, both in traditional and in digital painting. So, this painting seemed kind of like a perfect candidate for a quick tutorial because you have a kind of a soft atmospheric background and foreground, and then you just kind of have this hovering figure on their boat in the midground there. And it's the kind of painting that's perfect for a tutorial, because these tutorials for this first section are all very tool-based tutorials. I'm trying to show you guys how these tools work, what settings I use, how to mix and match this tool with other tools, etc. And when you're doing a tutorial like that, you don't want to be too bogged down in big compositional dialogue or long-winded color palette discussions. You just want to kind of get paint on canvas and be able to see how the tools work. The one thing that I have kept consistent in this tutorial with the other ones that I've done recently are that I have real color blending turned on, that I'm using some of my custom oil brush settings, and that when I get to the palette knife, you'll start to see the ways that I play with that tool as well. I'm not doing any pre-drawing. I'm not doing any sketching. I'm just going straight into the paint. And that's a good way to work if you're confident in your drawing skills and you feel like you've got a pretty good ability to see proportional relationships and you can place objects on the canvas with confidence. If you want to, that's always a good way to go. If you'd prefer to do your sketch and line work first, that's also great. Here you can see me using the palette knife and how it quickly can just mash together the colors in the background, but you can also turn the loading on and use it as a quick choppy mark that overall just has a lot of magnetism. It's a very powerful way to work. It's a bold and kind of almost like obnoxiously strong mark. So when you're throwing that down on your canvas, you kind of got to know what you're all about, be putting it in the right place, and be able to sort of set it and forget it. You want to be doing what my mentor always talks about, which is 3 looks, 2 thinks, 1 stroke. That 1 stroke with the palette knife is going to be strong, it's going to be bold, but if it's in the right place, it's going to work. So I like to use that palette knife all the time as a sort of, like I said, like the sidekick for my oils, but I think in this case, it works incredibly well as something that has a little bit more parity with the oil brush, or something that works even better in some cases for some applications. And you can see here how the oil brush will sometimes get really thick and it'll lay on really thick chunky paint. Well, the palette knife's great at just going in there and kind of smudging and knocking it down and making those textures a little bit more uniform. And I really love with the realistic color blending turned on that you get these greens and ochres and different colors coming out when the paint is mixing, and it mixes with the palette knife just as well and just as naturally as it does with the oil paint. It's just all about paint body thickness, and that's something you can do with your settings. So far so good, having a fun time bouncing between the oil brush and the palette knife. And what you got to remember is that, like, when you paint, you kind of want to always have 2 tools on hand. I often would break it down into these categories. I like to have a soft edge brush and a hard edge brush. And when you use the oil brush and the palette knife, you always have that. You can set up your oil brush to be kind of a soft edge brush, and you can just use that palette knife as the hard edge brush. But the palette knife is very powerful in that it can be used with or without loading. So it can take the loading down and it can just knock down any hard edge, making it nice and soft and organic. And then you can use it with loading turned on. And in that way, it can be that crispest, hardest edge that you find in the whole painting. So both are good, both are awesome, both are a lot of fun. And when using the palette knife, you can see here that there are actually 5 presets. The first one is the one that is the default, and it is the most utilitarian, most useful. It's great for blending. It's great for working over any area that has just a little bit of need for some refinement. It's great for knocking down complicated areas or softening areas that are just a little too chunky and too strong. The one next to it is kind of like an edge of the palette knife. It almost draws more like a tail-like shape instead of that big, firm, even mark. The next one over from that is the smudging palette knife tool. And then with that, it just acts like as a traditional, smudger or smudging tool, like in Photoshop, where it just moves the pigments and nudges them, and then things get blurry when you use it. And it works. It's fine. I don't use it very much. I prefer the other ones, but it does work like it looks like it works. Fourth one over is kind of like a smudge, but it does it in a kind of a smoky way. And then the final palette knife is this kind of noise palette knife where it mixes all kinds of things together, whatever's kind of in the general vicinity. But that said, even though the palette knife is great and it can do all kinds of amazing things, I like to be able to use it with the oil brush. That's how I like to use it the most. And even when I'm trying to use the palette knife exclusively, I'll find that I still want to use the oil brush with it. And I think that's just because as it stands right now, it's a tool that, while it has 5 very good presets, it really only has 2 sliders, whereas the oil brush has a lot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sliders with a couple different check boxes, and that's huge variety, huge power, huge customization. Where the palette knife does have a lot of customization because it has 5 individual settings and 2 sliders, and the whole idea of like loading and not loading. It is a very powerful tool as well, but I do still think that the oil brush is the king of the court when it comes to ArtRage tools. The palette knife, again, is like the perfect sidekick. That said, in this painting, I'm going to want to show you just a few more things that the palette knife can do, but I quickly want to get some of the drawing problems worked out of this painting real quick, and then we can go ahead and jump into that. As you can see that I've got the settings for my oil brush that have the thinners turned up and the loading down. What that means is my oil brush is going to work a little bit more like a scratchy dry brush technique, and it's going to work in a way that has a lot of control, where I can really have a good handle on what I'm doing and how this is all going to play out. That said, when I get to the palette knife, that's when I introduce a bit more chaos. And again, like I said, you want to have, maybe a hard edge and a soft edge brush. You want to have some order and you want to have some chaos. You want to have some ability to create variety in your painting in ways that don't take a heck of a long time. And that's what the oil brush is all about. It's about quick blending. It's about quick noise addition. It's about quickly knocking in shapes. And it's a lot about fun. So as you can see here, I am having a lot of fun. I'm able to use the different edges of the palette knife, as you can see with the presets, to make just interesting marks. You can see that the yellow sort of lily pad that I put in the background naturally mixes with the blue, and so you get these interesting color varieties emerging. And what's really fun about that is it's all just automatic. It's just the serendipity of the paint. And I love to show this kind of thing because that's what happens with real painting. Your brush will have a little bit of weird color on it, and you'll go in and try to put a little petal on a flower or whatever, and it just kind of, you get some happy accidents along the way. So that said, ArtRage oil brush, the best. ArtRage palette knife, the best. And you can see here the different sorts of noise and blending that you can get playing with these different tools. I think that my hope is that as people see these videos, they'll be interested to check it out, that they will play with these tools, and especially play with them in tandem, and that as things continue to evolve, as ArtRage continues to get full number updates, as all that starts to happen, we'll get even more variety and capacity out of this already deep and powerful palette knife. That said, we're getting close to the end of this video, and I just want to say thank you for checking it out. Again, this is a little more beginner oriented, whether that's for beginning digital painting or beginning digital painting in ArtRage specifically. That said, it's always important to see how people work and their workflow and how they're thinking about things. And with respect to this, these videos are going to keep getting more and more complex as we go. So hopefully you'll get a chance to try out some of these techniques. You kind of put them in your back pocket and can utilize them as we move further into these video series, and have more and more fun as we get more advanced with our techniques. You can see here again, just playing with the texture of bouncing right between oil brush and palette knife, and then different options, and just seeing what can happen. So I had a lot of fun with this one. It's just a very quick tutorial, a little demo, basically a tooltip tutorial. And thank you so much for checking it out, and take care. Hello and welcome back. This is Daniel Ibanez again with another ArtRage Vitae tutorial. This one's focused exclusively on blending and the virtues of wet on wet blending in ArtRage Vitae. So as you can see here, and as you saw before in some of my other tutorials, the paint stays wet, it mixes wet, it acts like real paint. And here you can grab, like, say, a cobalt blue, and then you could say maybe cad yellow light or something, like these true tube-based paints. You mix them together and you get real pigment mixing, like real pigment. Even though it's all digital, it's all virtual. This is amazing. So I've even taken my traditional paint palette, taken a photograph of it and use it as color samples to mix colors that are truly identical to my palette in oil paints, and the pigments mix perfectly. Now, if you're one of those nitpicky people who want it to be like super identically perfect, you can do that, and you can make it you can even edit the color profiles for how they mix, so that if you put two colors from the color wheel together, you can choose that outcome color, and you can get really into the details with the custom color profiles, and that's pretty epic. For this painting, what we're going to do is just keep it very simple, since it's really about blending. It's not about, how to draw anatomy or how to create a custom character or how to stylize human anatomy or anything like that. We're just doing a blending. This is really a tool-based demo looking at blending in ArtRage Vitae. And what you can see here is I'm just using a simple still life with a strong light source as my focal point here. So whether you're a beginner and you're like, hey, I'm going to color pick from my reference picture, or you're a little more advanced and you're going to kind of move away from that, or you're just in a rush and you're going to do a little bit of both, that's all fine. These tutorials are just here to give you options on how you might, learn something. So the big focus I want to have with you is using these brush settings. You can see my depth, gloss, loading, thinners, pressure, aspect, rotation, and stiffness over on the far left side of the screen. That's the brush settings I'm using. It gives me a really nice amount of control, but it still keeps the paint wet. So when you have brush strokes colliding into each other, the paint's going to mix in a natural way. So it's going to feel like wet on wet painting. You can see the paint mixing together, but it's not going to be really gooey, kind of slimy paint. That's one of the problems with oil paint in real life, and that can be one of the problems with ArtRage in the digital world, is if you get the paint too gloopy, it can get really muddy and be kind of a little out of control. And that's just one of the features of ArtRage, and I think that's a feature of traditional oil paint as well. So you kind of get to control that with the amount of paint you have and the loading. So you're like how much paint you're loading onto the virtual bristles, and then the thinners. So if you have like no thinner, then your loading it needs to be kind of a little on the lower end. And if you have more thinners, then you need to kind of pump the loading up a little bit to compensate. But you can see here that what I'm doing is using the palette knife. I have the palette knife set with no loading to quickly and easily just knock that wet on wet paint together. It's the most elegant sort of pairing of these tools. You can have the oil brush to do your lay-in, so you get all the local color painted in, and then you use the palette knife to just quickly knock that paint down and soften any edges that need to be softened. So leave the hard edges hard. You don't need to go in there with the palette knife. You don't need to do anything. But if you have a soft edge where you need to have a subtle transition, all you have to do is just come in quickly and just knock in with one or two brush strokes of the palette knife. Make sure, again, there's no loading on that palette knife. It's just used as then a blender or a mixing tool. And it will quickly and cleanly just soften off an edge and make something feel round. It'll make something feel smooth. It'll make that transition subtle. And that's just a great way to work, and a good two-step process for doing your painting. And as you can see here, just using the palette knife again, you get a smooth, even mix between different chroma, different hue, different value, whatever you're doing. So using the knife for soft edges, using the oil brush for hard edges. Here's my real color blending tutorial for ArtRage Vitae. Hopefully you enjoyed it. You can see the virtue of painting wet on wet. It's just a fast way to work. It saves you a ton of time. And once you get used to the tools, there's really nothing else like it in digital art. So thanks for checking it out. And hopefully this is a helpful but quick tutorial. Take care, and thanks again for looking at my content. Hey, welcome back. This is a really quick video that's going to show you how to turn any painting into an ArtRage looking painting. So this painting was one I did in Photoshop, and I thought it was fun. It was a fun way to paint my wife. It was really like this cool point of view with the leg foreshortening and stuff, and I just had a lot of fun with the color palette. But I wanted to give it that ArtRage feel, which means I want it to look like thick, chunky, real oil painting. And, nothing does that like ArtRage. So here's my tip and trick for getting any painting to look like it has that ArtRage feel. The key is to create a new layer. Set that layer to multiply. And if you paint with any color other than white, it's going to look weird. So set your color all the way over to the far side and let it be white. And you can see what's already happening here. But let's turn this back to normal. And I'm just going to paint over my entire painting. Since I'm on a separate layer, it's not going to ruin anything. It's just all separate. What I'm doing is basically just using this separate layer as a way to create thick impasto paint texture. And I'm going to just use that as an overlay, or rather a multiplied layer on top of my currently existing painting. And as you saw, I used the preset for the thick gloss square. So presets are a bunch of just kind of brush presets that ArtRage has. Use the thick gloss square and enjoy. The thick gloss square is really chunky, really bristly, really thick. And I thinned it out on just the aspect. So it's more of like instead of that square head, the brush head isn't just perfectly square. It's more of like a flat. But other than that, it's the pure default thick gloss square. And all I'm doing here is just painting over my whole painting. And I am paying attention to the surfaces and contours of the shapes that I'm painting over, but I'm not really worried about it. I just want to get that texture. And as you can see, it doesn't take any brain power at all. This is just simple. This is kind of monkey level stuff. One thing I guess you could pay attention to is that in the canvas settings, depending on how the virtual lighting is hitting your canvas, you can change the direction of that in the view canvas settings little panel. But if you kind of want to get a different look or at the texture, you'll notice that more horizontal strokes are going to have more of that texture and chunk, and more vertical strokes will have a little bit less. That's just because of the lighting angle of the canvas. And again, you can change that at will, but I like to kind of leave everything default just because it's not that big of a deal. The key here is just getting the whole canvas covered with paint strokes. And again, using pure white is really helpful because it doesn't change the hue or the value of the colors beneath. And assuming you did a good job with your painting, you probably don't want to mess those up. I discovered this and I just knew it was something I wanted to share. I've talked about it before, but I thought it was just important to do a quick little video of this so that it's just a nice and tidy single lesson way to show people how to do this. We all work all over the place, different apps, different platforms and stuff. So it's nice to be able to give some of that oil painting texture to your piece, even if you weren't lucky enough to be able to paint it in ArtRage. So let's take this next step together and look at how this is all going to shake out. Now that the canvas is all covered, what I want to do is go back to my layer and I want to click on that little thing that looks like a notebook and then go to blend mode and then change it to multiply. And you can see here, as I turn it on and off, especially when I zoom in, you can see the great impact that this texture has. It can look like real bristly varnished oil paint. And now that I have the whole thing established, I can go back in and refine stuff. Sometimes you'll have too much texture in one area and not enough. Maybe the texture is the wrong angle or whatever, and it just looks awkward, especially on the face. You can use this texture really, really well to add the kind of individual strands or the illusion of hair strands. You can use it as a way to echo and copy kind of the brush strokes that you used in your oil painting or whatever you're trying to make it look like in Photoshop. For this particular Photoshop painting, I was largely using Greg Rakowski's brushes, which have a nice oil feel, but I like to push that even further with ArtRage. So you can see this is one of my favorite tips and tricks. This is one of my secret sauce things that I wanted to share with you. And it's just so easy that there's no way you shouldn't be tinkering with this kind of stuff at sort of like a post-processing level. ArtRage has a lot of ways to interface with other software programs. You can even import a Photoshop file directly into ArtRage and do what I'm doing here. But in this case, I just had a JPEG exported out of Photoshop and I just brought that in, and that works too. But it's cool that you can import stuff directly from Photoshop with the layers, with all the features of the layers, and that is awesome. ArtRage is just one of those apps that just seems so simple, but it has so much depth. And you know, the reason, and I just love that it also plays nice with the other apps. So what you can see here is that if you kind of like this look, but you want it to be toned down a little bit, you can always change the opacity of the layer too. So you don't have to just multiply it. You can multiply it and then change the opacity. And then another thing, you know, I just started tinkering with this and it seemed like a good idea. And so I'm going with it. You can also use a little bit darker values, like I'm staying kind of with grayish tones or whatever, and utilize that multiply so you can push and pull your highlights and your shadows just a wee bit. As you can see here, the painting, you know, I felt like it read well, but I wanted to push the shadows a little bit in the eyes. I wanted to create a little variation and variety in the background. And you can do that with this multiply layer, and you can, the paint will blend in, and it's all wet on wet paint on that multiplied paint layer. So whether you're using white or gray or whatever, you're able to kind of push and pull those values, and it's going to blend naturally. So you're not going to run into any problems with this looking weird. It's going to just look super good. It's going to look super nice. And I think it's going to be fun for people. So yeah, you can see here, I'm just kind of adding some accents to the eyes, eyebrows, shadow from the hair, and all of that's done, you know, no risk, no danger sort of way, because all of this is already pre-painted and already finished, and everything I'm doing here is like non-destructive editing, and it's really fun. You know, when you finish a painting, it's nice to be able to have some different ways to tinker with it, and this is just one of my favorite ways to go about that. If you like this technique, you like this approach, you know, give this video a thumbs up. You know, let me know in the comments if you have another solution that works better. Again, let me know, but I just thought this was too fun not to share. And thank you guys so much for checking it out, and best wishes. Happy painting.